Yeah, so good, Nicole. Thank you so much. I want to take a moment before I begin some people ask me like, what is si se puede? So we're gonna say it together. Si se puede. Si se puede. So you can say that like that if you're talking about it, but really when you're like at the marches, at the rallies, you're supposed to like chant it out, si se puede, si se puede, si se puede. That's practice for later, okay? You'll see in a moment. I'm gonna start with the story I've shared in the past before, not from a history book, but from my family. I'm a Latino queer Unitarian Universalist minister, and I come from a migrant farm worker background. And I still have relatives who work the fields. That's not abstract for me. That's my people. My mother worked in the fields starting at 8 years old alongside her family. My stepfather's family worked a farm in Madera, and when the movement began to rise, when the United Farm Workers were organizing, they didn't stay on the sidelines. They housed traveling workers and when they were able, and even got to witness and join days of action when they could. They weren't the ones whose names made it into the history books, but they did their part. They understood something deeply spiritual, even if they never used that word, that when it's time to come together, you come together. And growing up, there was one name that seemed to hold all of that meaning, one name on the buildings, one name on the street signs, one name on the sculptures, one name on the murals, one name given a holiday, one name that carried the story, Cesar Chavez. He was a hero to me, a hero to many, a symbol of justice, a spiritual guide for righteous cause. His history felt like my family's story, and his history felt like my history. That's the story many of us were given, but it is not the whole story. Because alongside Chavez, organizing, strategizing, sacrificing, really, was another leader, Dolores Huerta. It was Huerta who coined the phrase, si se puede. But if we leave her there as the person who came up with the powerful phrase, we miss the deeper truth. Because Huerta didn't just say si se puede, she lived it in a way that was both deeply spiritual and relentlessly practical. Before she became a full-time organizer, she was a teacher. A stable job, a stable life, and she left it all behind into low pay, long hours, and uncertainty because she believed something more was possible for farm workers. She described that action as moving out in faith. Moving out in faith. Not certainty, faith. And that faith wasn't abstract. There were times she didn't have enough money, times she relied on others for food, for childcare, for support, times when the cost of organizing wasn't just political, it was personal. She gave what I can only describe as a kind of tithing of income, of comfort, of time with her own children. And still, she kept going. But here's where her theology becomes unmistakably clear. Because Huerta was not only organizing in the fields, she was organizing in the halls of power. She became one of the most effective lobbyists of her time, working in Sacramento and beyond in DC to secure real, tangible protections for farm workers, including the right to organize, protections against unfair labor practices, as well as access to services that had long been denied. And before she would go into those legislative hearings, before she would sit across from elected officials, she would stop at the cathedral. She would light the candles. She would pray. And then she would go do the work. At one point, she told a colleague, lighting the candles isn't enough. you have to work the committees too. You have to work the committees too. That's theology. Not a theology that says pray and wait. Not a theology that says work and forget the Spirit, but a both and. Light the candles and work the committees. Hold faith and take action. Trust in something larger than yourself, and then show up with everything you've got. And maybe that's what Si se puede really means. Not just that change is possible, but that possibility requires both spirit and struggle, both prayer and persistence, both community and courage. Huerta understood that se and si se puede was not passive. It's not, it just happens. No, that's not it at all. It actively conveys. It becomes possible when we align ourselves spiritually and collectively with the work that must be done. But if we're honest, most of us didn't learn that phrase from Huerta. We learned it through Chavez. We learned it later through a presidential campaign. We learned it translated into something more individual, more polished. Yes, we can. And in that shift, something subtle happened. The theology changed from collective emergence to collective branding, from a movement to a message. And if we look closer, we begin to see even more. Because the movement that became the United Farm Workers was not only built by Mexican-American organizers, it was also built by Filipino farm workers. Workers who had been organizing for decades before the Delano grape strike. One of those Filipino leaders was Larry Itliong. Larry Itliong. Itliong and the Agricultural Workers Organizing Committee were the ones who initiated the strike in 1965, and they knew it could not succeed alone. They needed solidarity, they needed partnership, they needed others to join. And so they reached out, and eventually the movements came together. That's the part we don't always tell. That before the famous marches, before the national attention, before the mythology, there was already collective action in motion. Already a si se puede, even if those exact words weren't being said. So what does this mean for us? It means that movements have never been about one person. Not Chavez, not Huerta, not Itliong. Movements are about communities, messy, imperfect, interdependent communities, coming together to do what no one could do alone. Which brings us to a harder truth. Because if we are going to talk about memory, if we are going to talk about theology, if we are also going to, then we also have to talk about complexity. In recent months, reports of sexual assault have surfaced about Cesar Chavez that complicate the story many of us were taught. So far, at least 5 women have shared about being his victims. Some were children, daughters of fellow organizers. Even Huerta herself was one of the victims of Chavez, having 2 of his children in secrecy while finding families to adopt and raise them. Huerta shared holding on to that truth for over 60 years. 60 years, because she feared jeopardizing the farm workers movement. That's a lot to learn and begin processing. For some, it is disorienting. For others, it is painful and grief-numbing. For many, it raises a really difficult question. What do we do when our heroes are not who we thought they were? What do we do as we see the holiday no longer celebrated, the statues taken down, the street signs removed, the murals covered up, and the buildings renamed, while still processing this pain and anguish? What do? We grasp our spirits gently as we move forward, because holding people accountable matters. Holding our heroes accountable matters. In a more traditional religious language, one might ask, what do we do when our saints are complicated? Because they always are. And if one's theology is built on individuals, on elevating singular figures upon pedestals to near sacred status, then one's faith becomes very fragile. It rises and falls on the character of one person. But if our theology is built on movements, on communities, on collective action, then it can hold complexity. It can make room for truth. It can adapt. It can continue. It can hold people accountable. This is where I believe Unitarian Universalism has something vital to offer. Our beliefs are diverse and inclusive. We have no shared creed. Our shared covenant is expressed through the inseparable, deeply harmonious values of interdependence, pluralism, justice, transformation, generosity, and equity, all centered on love. But those are not just beliefs. Those are commitments about what is possible together. And that's why I want to suggest that Si se puede is not just a chant, it is a theological statement. It is a declaration that possibility is not located in the individual, but in the collective. It is a rejection of the lie that we are alone. It is a refusal of despair. It is a practice of hope. So the question becomes, what do we believe is actually possible together? Si se puede. If you want to continue supporting migrant farm workers, si se puede. If you want to be part of the fight for immigration justice, si se puede. If you want to stand with the trans community in a time of increasing harm, si se puede. If you want to be a part of implementing climate justice initiatives to save our world, si se puede. If you want to resist violence, oppression, and systems that diminish life, si se puede. If you want to dismantle racism in our communities and in ourselves, si se puede. If you want to tell the truth even when it's uncomfortable, si se puede. If you want to choose love when hate feels louder, si se puede. If you want to believe that another world is not only possible, but already beginning, si se puede. Si se puede. But not alone, never alone, because it's not si yo puedo, it's not si tú puedes, it's si se puede. And if we are going to say si se puede, then we also have to ask, where are we being called to light the candles? And where are we being called to work the committees? Because one without the other is not enough. And that leads us to a practice, a spiritual practice, one that I want to invite us into as a congregation, the practice of naming the unnamed, of asking in every story we inherit, who else was there? Whose labor made this possible? Whose voices were overlooked? Whose names were not recorded? And then naming them out loud, because who we remember shapes what we believe is possible. This matters right now. It matters in our world, it matters in our movements, and it matters right here in this congregation. As this community discerns the artwork on our grounds, as we consider what stories we enshrine in physical form, we are engaging in theology. We are engaging in theology. We truly are. We are deciding whose stories do we lift up, whose stories do we complicate, and whose stories do we expand. And perhaps most importantly, whose stories are still missing. Because who we remember shapes what we believe is possible. I think about my family again. They were not famous. They were not leading marches. Their names are not written in books, but they showed up when they could. They opened their homes, they supported the movement, they lived Si se puede, even if no one ever said their names. And I wonder how many stories like that exist in this room. How many quiet acts of courage, how many unseen contributions, how many lives shaped by collective care. So I leave you with this. Our faith is not only in what we believe, it is in who we remember and how we choose to remember them. Si se puede is not just something we say, it is something we practice. When we show up, when we join the work already being done, when we build where there is an absence, when we refuse to let another story be told as if only one person made it possible. Because the truth is, it can be done. Not by me, not by you, but by something that happens between and among us. Amen. Let it be so. Y si se puede. Thank you. Thank you. I'm still shaking. That was hard to write, and I loved giving it. Thank you for letting me have this space to do that. We close with "We shall not be moved," and "No nos moverán," an African-American spiritual that has been sung in movements for social change and labor rights since the 1930s in both English and in Spanish. Please rise and let's sing together.